So Joe, you're the CEO of the Hunter Joint Organisation, which is a group of councils in the Hunter. Can you tell us a little bit about the Hunter Joint Organisation and what's their relationship, I guess, with helping to coordinate around the energy transition in the region?
Yeah, happy to, and thanks for the invite to talk, Amanda. Look, the joint organisation is a collaboration of 10 councils. Councils have collaborated in the Hunter since 1955 in some guise or another, and joint organisations is just the next evolution of that local government collaboration. Joint organisations, how they've evolved is they've got a statutory mandate now. So they're statutory entities and they have three key statutory functions. So determine regional strategic priorities, advocate for those priorities and build intergovernmental collaborations around those priorities. One of the key priorities that the member councils have said is a collaborative opportunity is the need for economic diversification in the face of changing global energy technology markets, right? And which has a key impact on the demand for a key output of ours, which is coal. And we're proposing a very specific, Hunter-specific solution to that. And we've coined it the Hunter 2050 Foundation. And the three, that's a partnership between the region and state and federal government. And its three key functions are to develop expertise in operating investment capability or funds around SMEs, industrial land redevelopment, and new energy projects. That's one of the functions. A second function is to provide support programs to business and workforce in the context of transition at a regional scale. And then the third one is to undertake place-based research and partnerships with other relevant entities and institutions within the region. Okay,
so that's separate to the group of councils. What's the relationship between the two?
So I can touch on it a bit later in a bit more detail, but in essence, it's an initiative, and we have collaborations and partnerships with other, we have many partnerships with the state government around specific projects or programs. So it's a specific initiative or a partnership that we're proposing to deal with this particular issue. And the role of the JO would be to form part of, I suppose, a regional coalition that would take leadership of this entity. And there's a specific model that I can dig into that talks about, okay, what's the role of local government in the context of that initiative, which is not just a single project, but it's has a much broader focus of time sort of contemplated.
Okay, so up until this point, you've got the Hunter Joint Organisation, so the group of councils doing their role as a group of councils, being that voice and the advocacy for the local region and making sure that there's coordination to other levels of government. But now this specific issue is getting its own kind of body to focus specifically on how to manage changes across the region.
Yeah, so I think that's right. I think it has to do with the nature of the issue, understanding the nature of the problem, and then designing a solution to fit. And I mentioned before that some of the elements of our particular solution are Hunter specific. We did a lot of work looking at what other regions have done globally and nationally. We did a trip down to Latrobe and looked at what they'd done down there. And there is that need to take a place-based approach and to think very specifically about what is the there are some very common elements that happen in almost all the solutions at work, right? And they almost all have some sort of investment focus. They almost all have some sort of workforce and business support focus, and they almost all have some sort of partnership, collaboration, research focus. So basically understanding our area even better, right? And working together. So they all have those elements, but it's the way you apply those elements to your local context.
Yeah. So ideas of where the funding comes from for that?
Yeah. So
are you allowed to share that?
Yeah. So I think well, there's two. When people talk about funding, there's two elements that are important. One is the funding to operate an entity, right? Typically, that's either government or a combination of government and private funds, and typically you see solutions where they're funded by the levels of government that have the funding, the funding available, which in Australia's case, and in our case in the Hunter, to be state or federal government. But what we've proposed in terms of operating funds is that the region itself would come to the table, and that would be a partnership with local government and industry and institutions within the region, and to get that sort of initial operating capital up. By comparison, I think in the first 4 years of the Latrobe Valley Authority, I think they were given $20 million by the state government, right, to operate.
The first 4
First 4 years, yeah.
Just for operations.
Yeah, just operations.
They had like a $300 million budget for everything else.
Oh, that's projects. So when you talk about projects, and then the other funding that is important is at a macro level. What we're doing here is we're saying, as a region, the markets we participate are going to change. The capital that's been invested is going to depreciate or no longer be producing valuable economic output. So you need new capital, right? And so a lot of this exercise to sustain jobs and sustain quality of life is about bringing new capital into the region. And one of the things that, again, that's Hunter specific is there are some really good mechanisms to do that. And some of them are operated by the state and some of them are already operated by local government, some of my member councils. But they tend to be on a project by project basis. But when you're talking about volumes of capital globally, and I had experience with this when I led the privatisation of Port Botany when I was in a port organisation, there's a lot of pension and super funds that have a lot of footloose capital that's looking for a home, and it's about the mechanisms to get that money into a region in a way that those capital controllers can see a value proposition. And so that's part of the solution that the 2050 Foundation is focusing on. So we don't want to duplicate what's already happening in the region. We want to fill a gap, and there is a gap in that space. And I think it's probably true of most of regional Australia, that access to capital is not nearly as easy as if you're in a metropolitan area.
Yeah, I've been in boardrooms in Sydney and Melbourne with investors who are saying, oh, we want to invest in regional projects, but we can't actually connect. And then I'm in the rooms in regions where they're saying we can't get money from investment. And there's something about matchmaking and to make it easier and to reduce the risk for investors, I guess, too, because they see, and also getting the scale of investment right. So there's a real coordination piece around that.
I'm convinced that conceptually this is probably one of the soundest things I've ever worked on. It's the design bit that we're getting into now, which is saying, okay, because it's not been done, it's been done in the context of different, it's been done in the context of much more specific issues. So you can have like a topic like clean energy or so funding on that sort of basis. People have put funds together on that. They haven't put funds together around place as much. And that's the trick, for me, is understanding and that's deeply understanding your place, like what makes a sound investment proposition from the place to those sort of capital controls.
Interesting.
I think the three things that we said, important design principles. Government must be involved, because government at all levels pulls policy and funding levers that affect your opportunity as a region to participate in different markets, right? Okay. So government must be involved. You must take a place-based approach, and that just comes back to that. In any business, in any enterprise, you need to understand your comparative and competitive advantages when you successfully participate in those markets. And it must be enduring and flexible, because this is not the work of a month or a year, but probably decades. So they're the design principles. So our particular model around the foundation is a Corporations Act entity, controlled.
So a company.
A company, Yep. Controlled by the region, with a skills-based board, right?
Controlled by the region. Who in the region?
Great question. So one of the key advantages of our structure is that it enables local leadership. So we see that a regional coalition, probably with local government and industry and key institutions being the sort of the members. It's hard to make community itself, in its truest sense, a member. And probably one area of further development in our own model is looking at how you make sure that community voice is enduring, and some touch points in this sort of entity. But that local leadership is critical. You know, it is what gives any approach its place-based, particularly one that's through time. It gives it its place-based. It grounds it in place, is what I'd say, and it gives it the passion that people need to endure through what is a long process, right? It connects it, yeah. The other elements that have key advantages, it's got to be robust and adaptable, which is a Corps Act company allows you to, it needs to be robust but adaptable, and Corps Act companies allow you to do that in a way that statutory vehicles do not. And I say that having worked in multiple statutory vehicles. And ultimately, the nature of the statutory vehicle means it will be controlled by the state or federal government, because they control the mechanism, through any sort of evolution or change that needs to be made. It'll be controlled by the state or federal government. So it's not controlled from the place.
Yeah.
And it allows flexibility in terms of partnerships. So again, once you ask the state or feds to set up an entity, if it's an entity that's legislative, it automatically gets politicized, and it doesn't allow the government as much flexibility in terms of how they can. They're constrained automatically by the strictures that they put in place, whereas you can and governments do it all the time through grant programs or other. They find ways of putting funding on a project or program basis into something where they can set the parameters of their engagement. And get more comfortable with that. So there's a lot more flexibility. So yeah, I would say the key advantages: local leadership, robust but adaptable structure, and flexibility and partnership with government through time. And I say this in a context of where we are, which is concept design and establishment phase, right? So the key constraints I've found are maintaining a local collaboration, maintaining momentum through time. So that's the nature of collaboration itself is a key constraint. I might come back to that. The other key constraints are state and federal governments aren't quite ready to give increased self-determinations to region. I think that's that is a key,
really?
That is a key constraint in any model. And then the lack of the other constraint is the lack of a crisis is a key constraint, right? So typically these institutions get stood up. Typically, not always, but typically they get stood up when you're in crisis mode, right? And so that's a key constraint. If I dig into each of those, collaboration by its nature is hard. It requires parties to come together with a shared interest, but to put aside some of their self-interest for the greater shared interest. And the longer that collaboration needs to be maintained before you get to the next milestone, the harder it becomes, because people are appropriately doing their own jobs or doing their own roles, right? When you're bringing institutions together, that can be hard to maintain. So collaboration itself is a constraint, particularly in establishment. Self-determination, because of the obvious systems issue of saying, hey, give us more authority, more autonomy within a region, and you're trying to do that ideally without changing any of the existing system, right? Particularly within the state context. So it's really about getting decision makers head around that, and then the lack of a crisis. Again, we went to La Trobe, and when we sort of dug into that with some really passionate and incredible people at the La Trobe Valley Authority, they said, look, it wasn't like there was a lack of reports that talked about this issue that was sort of there, and from the time of privatization of in Victoria of energy companies, there were plenty of red flags, and so yeah, that's that. Yeah,
but that's a problem. There's kind of lots of crises now, and probably going to be more in the next 10 years. But there's a build-up of them, and the more that we have, the harder it's going to be to advocate for something to get established. Yeah.
It's governments are really critical because they set parameters around what we think as a collective group is okay, or what we want, or how we want to do something. But then the decisions that get made within that typically are by owners of capital who go, here, I'm going to participate in this market. I think I can add value to this market. And the decision to do that, and when I reduce down in Hunter, looking at we've got a single commodity that participates in a single market around energy consumption, and it's being influenced by energy technologies. The really simple paradigm was, we've got to replace all that capital, right? Because we don't control that market. Either people will choose to consume energy in a different way because technology enables them to do it, right? And that's a true statement. And people, if you accept that's a true statement, then unless you can find another use for thermal coal, then that market disappears for us. And so we need to find new markets to participate in. And that's typically, my experience and both my actual experience and my sort of theoretical understanding says, well, that's not going to be the role of government. Governments typically don't go, oh, we'll decide what markets, and then there's this where self-determination comes in as well. I also say this for local government. So I don't think the region wants to be told by state or federal government, how it should live its life, or what markets it should participate in. But equally, I don't think anyone in the region would say, oh, local government, tell us, in your wisdom, what market should we participate in? And that comes back to what is the role of any level of government. And locally, it is about what are those things that we can do to enable, and the leadership that we can provide, particularly around collaboration, about coming together and saying, what's the challenge that we face specifically in our place, and then and then how should we collectively solve it? And I think that's how we've determined. So on that broader issue of economic diversification, yes, we see we've got a key role in providing leadership, to it. But when the 2050 Foundation is, and it's not to say that local government wouldn't do other things in the economic diversification space, but it is to say there is in the context of the problem we have, there is a need for a very specific solution, and it needs to be place-based, and it needs to be supported. It needs to be in partnership with state or federal government, and you need a vehicle, and the local leadership needs to have industry and community input into that. And the JO itself is not a vehicle for that. It's controlled by 10 member councils. So it's recognizing that the collaborative vehicle we have is not collaborative enough. Maybe that's the way of putting it.
Thanks for your time.
Thanks very much for your time, Amanda.